Welcome to Belly Dance Alchemy, a captivating blend of the best elements of career and professional development and the magic of belly dance. I'm your host, Kelly Nottingham. Ready to make your day job sparkle and your dance life grow in new and inspiring ways? Well, let's see what we can brew up. Hello, dancers, and welcome to our first full-length episode of Belly Dance Alchemy. We're going to start off this episode with a little exercise in our imaginations. So I'd like for you to imagine that you have been invited to perform in a show coming up in about a month. Your first thought is flattery and excitement. Oh my gosh, they picked me to perform in this show. This is fantastic. And one split second later, you get hit over the head with a bunch of other thoughts. Thoughts like, I'm not going to be as good as the other people that are performing, so maybe I should say no. I don't know what music to choose or what costume to wear, so I should probably say no. I'm not going to look very good in my costume because I haven't been exercising as much because I've been stuck in my house for 4 months. People are going to look at me performing and think, why is she up there with everybody else? And this is my big chance to make a grand performance on a big stage in front of a lot of people, and I'm going to fall flat on my face. Now, if any of these sound familiar to you, hopefully today's topic will be of use. Today we are talking about perfectionism and what it is and what it isn't. We're going to be talking about the 3 types of perfectionism and the different ways that perfectionism can manifest itself in our work and in our dance. Perfectionism for a long time has been used somewhat interchangeably with having really high standards. And I've heard people say that perfectionism is not a bad thing because it drives you to do better. It's often that go-to answer for an interview when you go for a job interview and they ask you that annoying question of, what is one thing that you would say about yourself that you need to work on? And that standard answer is, well, I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist about my work, and it's because I have such high standards. Now, I'm sure we will probably do a podcast at some point about interview skills and how we can use our dance skills in job interviews. But I will go ahead and give you a little teaser here. Don't use that answer. It's become such a standard answer that it's not really taken seriously anymore. Because here's the thing. Perfectionism is not the same as having high standards. Having high standards can be great. Perfectionism is having unachievably high standards. Perfectionism is an attempt to control the outcome of a situation that may not even be controllable. It's beating ourselves up over our past mistakes and even perceived past mistakes. And it's trying to control our future by obsessing over the past. So we end up missing the present completely. The process of what we're doing, we lose our perspective on what's actually important. So there are 3 types of perfectionism. Let's see if any of these resonate with you. The first is self-oriented perfectionism. Now, this is imposing an unrealistic desire to be perfect on yourself. It's not due to other people watching what you're doing or seeing that you may be making a mistake. It's you yourself beating yourself up for a standard that you've set in your head that nobody else may be looking at, but if you do not hit that standard, then you are somehow a failure. The next type of perfectionism is other-oriented perfectionism. Now, this is imposing those unrealistic perfectionist standards on other people. So this is a tendency to demand or expect perfection from your friends, your family, maybe coworkers, spouses, and this can be particularly damaging for intimate relationships. So, for example, a dance teacher who expects 100% on every single move, every single practice. Bosses who expect 100% on every single report that comes across their desks. Parents who are intolerant of mistakes by their children. Some of you may have seen the movie, and this is an older movie, I'm dating myself a little bit here, a 1991 movie featuring Julia Roberts called Sleeping with the Enemy, where she was married to an extreme other-oriented perfectionist and really created a horrific situation for her to live in, trying to live up to those standards. The third type of perfectionism is the one that I think a lot of us think of most often, especially in today's heavily influenced social media world that we live in. This is called socially prescribed perfectionism. So this is perceiving unrealistic expectations of perfectionism from other people. This type is based on perception once removed. Let me explain what I mean by that. It isn't our own perception of our own failures. That's that self-oriented perfectionism. It's the perception that we have of other people and their judgment of our work. So we're basically trying to mind read here. Psychologist Gordon Flett explains that socially prescribed perfectionism has an element of pressure combined with a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. Socially prescribed perfectionists tend to feel that, according to Flett, quote, the better I do, the better I'm expected to do, end quote. This type of perfectionism, and frankly all type of perfectionisms, have a strongly negative focus because the focus is not on true success. It is on failure avoidance. You're trying not to fail. The focus is not on growth, but on I am not acceptable or lovable if I am not perfect. And because perfectionism ties itself to what we value or what we think other people value, it's always a moving target. And because it's always a moving target, it's impossible to achieve. Perfectionism can have some serious potential consequences. Perfectionism smothers you like a wet blanket over your creativity, your esteem, your motivation, your confidence, and your productivity. So where does perfectionism come from? There's actually a lot of ongoing research on this right now, so I'm not going to dig into this topic very much. There's some researchers that say that this may come from early trauma in our lives. Others that say that that's not necessarily the case. So that discussion is ongoing. That's fine. We will keep learning and keep getting better. Not perfect, but better as we start to learn more about this. So let's look at some examples of perfectionistic thinking. There are 4 major types of perfectionist thinking. So there's black and white thinking. This says that things are either one way or the complete opposite way. There is no gray area in between. So anything less than perfection is a complete 100% failure in these types of thinking scenarios. Someone who says things like, if I need help from others, then I am weak. If I make a mistake, then I am a horrible dancer. Black and white thinking. There's no middle ground in this. The second type of perfectionist thinking is catastrophic thinking. This is what I like to think of as sort of the Chicken Little syndrome, right? So if I make a mistake in front of my coworkers, I'm not going to be able to survive the humiliation. If I fall in the middle of the show, it's going to stay with me for the rest of my life and I'm never going to get back on stage again. I can't handle having somebody upset with me because if I make a mistake, they're going to be mad at me or upset with me. This is taking one small misstep and turning it into, I'm going to be stuck living in a van down by the river. The third type of perfectionistic thinking is probability overestimation. Now, that's a big phrase that basically is overestimating the likelihood that something really bad is going to happen. So here is an example. I have spent the last month and a half preparing for this performance, but despite that, I know I'm not going to do well. Or my teacher will think that I'm lazy if I skip class this week, even though I'm not feeling well. The fourth type of perfectionistic thinking are should statements. Saying things like, I should never make mistakes. I should never come across as nervous or anxious before a performance. If I were really good at dance, I wouldn't be nervous. I shouldn't be nervous. I should always be able to predict problems before they happen. So if you hear the word should going on in your brain a lot of the time, then that may be a clue to you that you have some perfectionism going on. Now, in our example that we started off our session with, we had a dancer who had been invited to perform in a show, and this should be exciting. So let's say that you're in that situation, and you have a month to get ready for this performance. And the first week, you say, okay, I'm going to pick up my music, I'm going to pick out a costume, And I'm going to go ahead and get started on figuring out the mapping of the music so I know, what to do during the song. That first week passes by and you say, okay, I've got 3 weeks left. I really need to pick out the music. I really need to pick out a costume, and I really need to map out my music. That week comes and goes. Week 3 comes up and you say to yourself, okay, I really have to decide on a song. I'm just going to go ahead and pick one, and then I'm going to ask 7 of my dancer friends, is this a good song to do? I'm not sure. Or maybe I should do this other song. And they help you decide on a song. And then you sit down and you say, I'm not sure I'm mapping the music quite right. I'm not sure that I know what to do. Maybe I should do this move. Maybe I should do this move. And then you practice and you keep changing it. And you're not sure if you should have your hands this way or your hands this way. And so you decide to make a long to-do list to help yourself get ready for this performance that's now happening in a week. And you say, these are the things I need to do for the rest of this week to be ready for this performance. Okay, it took me an hour to write out my list, so I'll work on this tomorrow. And then you get up the next day and say, well, I need to revisit the list because I'm not sure that I actually had everything that I needed to on the list. So you end up spending all of that time on the list. And on the last day before the performance, or, oh, God forbid, the day of the performance, you spend 5 hours practicing to try to get everything to be at least decent enough. And then you feel so frustrated with yourself when the time comes that you just want to give up. You just don't even want to do it anymore. And all of the joy that should be involved in this performance gets completely sucked out of your actual performance experience. Those of you who are just chuckling to yourselves, saying, oh my God, she knows me. It's because I have done the same things so many times, y'all. I am a really, really good procrastinator and perfectionist. And I say good in the sense that I have become adept at doing it, not that I should be doing it. This is one of those constant battles. For those of us who deal with perfectionism, this can be a struggle. So these perfectionistic behaviors, let's talk through these really quickly. Some examples of these. Chronic procrastination. You have difficulty completing tasks, or you give up on them easily and think, well, I'll work on it tomorrow, I'll work on it tomorrow, I'll work on it tomorrow. And pretty soon tomorrow is 3 weeks later. You get overly cautious and thorough in your tasks. So you spend 3 hours working on something that only takes other people 20 minutes to complete. Now, I will mention as an example here something that I tell my students in my costuming workshops. If you step back 5 feet and you cannot see the detail that you're working on your costume, then let it go. Because if you are so hyper-focused on getting every single bead onto your costume in exactly the perfect spot, you're going to spend 4 hours on something that should have only taken you 30 minutes. So that cautiousness and being overly thorough because you tend to lose a little perspective. This is where that stepping back 5-10 feet, probably going to give you some healthy perspective. Another way that perfectionism shows up is excessive checking. So one way that this shows up in our work lives might be spending 30 minutes looking over a really brief email to your boss because you might have spelling mistakes. Sending your music to 7 different people to have them listen to it and see if they think that it's a good song to listen to. There's nothing wrong with getting someone else's opinions, and in fact, it can be very, very helpful, but when it gets to the point where you're asking everybody that you know to chip in a thought or an opinion before you have really been able to formulate one of your own, that's a sign of perfectionism. Next up is constantly trying to improve things by redoing them. So rewriting a work document several times to make it perfect. Reworking a choreography because it's not perfect. This idea is that good enough is never good enough. Next up, agonizing over small details. So this again can show up in dance where you're not sure if your movements are exactly the right ones for the music. instead of letting the music flow through you a little bit and then just letting it go. We've talked about making elaborate to-do lists. And y'all, this is one I tend to fall into. I fall into the to-do lists and the let me reorganize myself again situation. Some of you may do too. I'll get started as soon as I feel organized enough. I'll get started once I have my list done. And that is in itself a form of perfectionism that will turn into a form of procrastinating. Perfectionism also holds us back from trying new things and taking healthy risks because we're afraid we're going to make mistakes. And this is where I tend to see my dance students and dance friends sometimes really struggle. And it's difficult to watch when you see someone who has so much joy to give to the world through dance, whether it's a perfect dance or not. It's the joy, it's the emotion, it's the connection, and they hold that back because they're afraid of being judged. It's tragic. All right, so the rest of this episode, we will be talking a little bit about how to overcome perfectionism. So the first thing I want to jump into with this, if you've identified some of these things as you've listened to this episode that sound very familiar to you, you may have some perfectionistic tendencies. The first thing I wanted to say is that there is no perfect way to fix your perfectionism. I'm going to say that again. There is no perfect way to fix your perfectionism. It is an experiment in what works for you. So think about if you have perfectionistic tendencies either in your dance, in your home life, in your work life, think about approaching it as an experiment. We're going to look at fixing some versus all or nothing. The opposite of perfectionism is not imperfection. The opposite of perfection is reality. Tamar Chansky says it's possibility. It's all the magnificent points that exist all around the bullseye. And I love that idea because when we look at our art and we look at our lives as a creative expression of our unique selves, it's not going to be a bullseye every time. And that's what makes life so interesting. It's what makes other people so interesting. It's what makes you, dear listener, so interesting is that you are not perfect. So as you approach overcoming your perfectionistic tendencies, here are some things to look at. Awareness of your thoughts and emotions that trigger your behaviors. Now, this is a big one. So when you catch yourself falling into your perfectionism trap, either in thinking or behaviors, you can ask yourself some different questions and actually answer them. Things like, so what's actually working right now? What am I actually enjoying right now? What is the point of what I'm doing right now? Am I meeting that purpose? And if I'm not, what do I need to shift to meet that purpose? If things aren't working so well, don't give up. Just ask yourself what's not working. So I'll give you an example to this one. Several years ago, I was falling into a really bad perfectionistic trap with my dancing. And I was coming home, I was practicing, I was going to classes. I think I was taking like 5-6 classes a week. I was practicing at home and I was getting really angry with myself because I wasn't good enough. I was feeling very competitive with other dancers, both in person and dancers that I saw online. And I was wondering, like, why can't I dance like that? And I'm not any good because I can't dance like that. And I've got to work harder. And my husband finally said to me one day, he said, Kelly, why did you start belly dancing? And I said, well, because I wanted to meet new people and I wanted to move and I wanted to try something different that I thought would be fun and, maybe get to wear sparkly costumes and, just enjoy myself a little bit. And he said, then why are you doing this to yourself? Because this is not that. This is not what you're doing right now is not the reason you started dancing. And I had to take a big, huge step back and say, you're actually 100% Right. You're right. I had lost perspective. So I started having to ask myself different questions. When I was in class or working on a choreography, I started asking myself questions like, what am I enjoying right now? What brings me happiness about this right now? And if I'm not feeling happy about it, then maybe what do I need to shift or do differently to make myself feel better about it? Honestly, sometimes that answer was, I need to just take a rest today because my body is tired and I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, and instead I'm going to lay down on the couch and I'm going to watch an episode of Midsummer Murders and I'm going to pet my cat and I'm going to knit something. And that taking a step back and giving yourself perspective sometimes can really, really help. But it's important when we are working through these behaviors and these thought traps of all or nothing thinking, should thinking, catastrophic thinking, to catch those thoughts going through our heads. So if you start to you don't even have to really think about it too hard. Honestly, just thinking about what those might look like will start to put a filter in your brain so that you can start to catch those thoughts as they bubble up. The next way of dealing with perfectionism is to ask yourself, are you trying to mind read what someone else expects of you? What would they say if you actually asked them about their expectations? And then the next question is, do you have to live up to those expectations? Now, this is another one, again, that shows up at work if you have a boss that maybe has not been very clear with you on the expectations for your job, and you feel that you need to do blank, blank, blank to make that person satisfied with your work performance, but you haven't really discussed it with them, so you don't actually know what their expectations are. The same comes up in our dance classes. We may have expectations that our teacher will be disappointed in us if we don't hit a certain skill level by a certain time, whether or not our teacher actually thinks that way. Talk to your teacher, talk to your leader, find out what those actual expectations at work and in your dance actually are. You may find that their expectations aren't anywhere near what you thought they were. You may also find out that if they have unrealistic expectations, you're like, I don't actually have to do that. I can make decisions and say no and set boundaries for myself. Now, there may also be some very deep underlying reasons why you have perfectionism. And again, as I mentioned, they're still doing a lot of research on this, but there are social psychologists who say that there are precursors to perfection, things like a need to be accepted, to feel wanted, and to feel cared for. Those needs may be driving that perfectionistic behavior. Now, if you find that you think that may be the case, find a counselor or therapist that you can talk to, because those types of precursors to perfection are likely going to be bubbling up in multiple places in your life, not just in your dance. So some other ways to think about overcoming perfectionism. Changing your perspective and looking from someone else's perspective. So let's say you just got done with a performance and you're not really happy with it. Let's pretend that it was your best friend that performed instead. What would you say to your best friend? Probably not the same things you say to yourself. What would you say to a child that was feeling the way that you were about a performance that they did? Probably not the same things that you say to yourself. Our inner monologues really affect our behaviors. They affect our thoughts. They affect our feelings. They affect our stress levels. They affect psychologically and physiologically how healthy we are. So if you find yourself beating yourself up over this, would you say those same things to a friend? Because you are your own friend, right? So say those things to yourself instead. Another way of thinking about shifting to a different perspective is being realistic about the fact that we only have 24 hours in a day. And I will say this. Now, I love Oprah. I love Oprah. But I have heard people say, well, Oprah only has 24 hours in a day, too. Yeah, Oprah has people to do things for her. Oprah is not cleaning her own cat boxes. You know what I'm saying? We have to prioritize, because if we prioritize everything, then nothing is a priority. If everything is important, nothing is important. And so we have to make decisions about what are the most important things for us to accomplish. We also can look at the big picture. Will this matter in a year, 2 years, 5 years? Is the cost of doing this to this level worth the payoff in 2, 5, 10 years? Another question that some of you are probably going to cringe a little bit when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Compromising. What level of imperfection are you willing to tolerate? Now, my sister is brilliant. I love my sister very much. And she's a very smart person. She told me one time when I was working on my master's degree, and I was procrastinating on my master's thesis and finishing it. She called me one time and said, Kelly, done is better than perfect. What she meant was, 1, procrastination doesn't accomplish anything except adding more stress and shortening my timeline. And 2, I need to find where I can compromise to get things done, or otherwise I'm never going to get it done because I'm trying to make it perfect. So done is better than perfect has become a life motto for me. It has become a life motto for a lot of people that I've worked with. Thank you, Rachel. Now, here's a fun one. Another way to think about perfectionism is intentionally go against your perfectionist tendencies. So make mistakes and don't fix them. Set a timer and say, I'm going to work on this work project or choreography or rehearsal or costume, whatever it may be, for the next 30 minutes or an hour. And at that time, it is going to be good enough. Set a timer until good enough. And when that timer goes off, you're done. Now, this can be scary, but it can be very liberating to let yourself only have a certain amount of time, because you'll find that generally the 80% of good stuff that you come up with, you come up in the 20% of the time that you spend on it, right? You can practice imperfection. Take up a hobby that you know you're going to just suck at and do it anyway. And nobody has to see that you do crayon drawings of animals, and it can be for fun. Now, this sounds silly, but practicing imperfection like this, starting something that you know you don't have to do a good job at, and just laughing at yourself can be so freeing. Now, the last one is to pretend, in whatever scenario that you are being perfectionistic in, pretend that you're improvising, that you're not doing a choreography. I mean, let's face it, life is one big, huge improvisation, right? There's so much we can't control. We try to control, but we can't control. But we can do our best in the moment that we're in. We can be satisfied that we did the best that we could in that moment and move on and not beat ourselves up for what we maybe did. We could have done this differently. I could have done this better. You know what? It's done. It's over. We're moving on. So those are some things to think about as you're working through any perfectionistic tendencies that you may have. Be aware of your thoughts and emotions. Look from a different perspective. Be realistic in your thinking. Look at that big picture and try to become aware of when you may be starting to fall into those perfectionism traps. Now, note that I said try and not do perfectly the first time or you're a failure. This is where we're working into our gray areas here, not I have to do it exactly right the first time. All right, dancers, that's the end of our perfectionism episode. I hope that this was a helpful episode for you. If you have any thoughts or questions or ideas on this, situations that you've been through that you would like to share, I would love to hear them. Please feel free to reach out to me. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to this podcast and share the magic with your dance friends. If you want more, you can sign up for our mailing list at bellydancealchemy.org, or you can email me your suggestions and feedback. I would love to hear from you at bellydancealchemypodcast@gmail.com. Bye.